Barnaby began this long divorce proceeding claiming that he was upset about the fact that we still had net zero in our policy platform, and the National Party first and now the Liberal Party have abandoned quite properly the net zero straitjacket. But Barnaby, instead of saying let's reconcile, he's saying nah, sorry, there are a whole lot of other things that were really driving me out, so I'm off. Now I just think that's a little bit beneath him.
2025 is a year of change. Cultural and political disruption is transforming our nation and the global order. The rebellion against the establishment has accelerated. Australia and the Western Alliance is now at a crossroads. Either the mainstream will continue its ascendancy or the elites will prevail. G'day Tony, and welcome back to all of our viewers and listeners. Great to be with you. Today Tony will be sharing his insights on the new nature positive laws, as well as the inflation which is surging, and the issues pertaining to Ukraine and foreign affairs. Tony, great to be back with you.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, well, let's start with this deal that's just been done today between Labor and the Greens on this new environmental regulation, which is so-called nature positive. The centrepiece of this is the establishment of a national environmental protection agency, as well as the so-called national interest test, which would essentially allow the government to expedite renewables projects and critical minerals projects, but heaven forbid they're not allowed to do it for fossil fuel projects. So this looks like a lot of green tape and red tape that's going to be imposed on our productive sectors of the economy. What's your perspective on this, Tony?
Well, Dan, I hate to sound like a knee-jerk pessimist, but any deal between the Labor government and the Greens is almost certainly going to be bad news for the economy, bad news for jobs, and bad news for the kind of resources sector that we need to boom in this country to maintain our standards of living. It was, I think, very telling that the main concession that the Greens have wrung out of the government is to exempt coal and gas projects from this fast-track pathway. So really, what this is going to end up being in practice is a way of expediting new solar farms, expediting new wind farms. Everything else will just be in the same logjam. In fact, the logjam is almost certainly going to get worse. I guess the other point I'd make is that I am very, very suspicious of all these new independent regulators, because we know what that means. It means that captured bureaucracies will be making decisions. Captured, unelected, unaccountable bureaucracies will be making decisions. And frankly, the democratic deficit throughout the Western world, but particularly in Australia, is getting worse and worse and worse. One of the reasons why so many people fret that it doesn't matter who they elect, nothing much changes, is because so much has been taken out of the hands of the elected and accountable politicians and put into the hands of these unelected bureaucrats. Now, I think that decision-making should be much more in the hands of ministers and much less in the hands of quongos. And if the minister makes a decision that people think is wrong, they can sack him. They can get rid of the government. But if it's the bureaucrats that are making decisions, where's the accountability? So look, I fear that this latest change is just going to increase the whole sovereign risk problem that Australia suffers from at the moment. I mean, you talk to anyone in the resources sector and they say that when it comes to sovereign risk, Australia is worse than Mexico. Now, once we were one of the best places in the world to invest and to do business. 10 years ago, certainly, we were a very good place to invest and do business because you could get environmental approvals relatively quickly. It's become almost impossible. I mean, look at what happened to the gold mine, the McPhillamys gold mine near Blaney in New South Wales. I mean, we should never forget the torture that the Adani mine in Queensland was put through. We still haven't finalised approvals for the Northwest Shelf gas extension, even though that is absolutely critical to our future prosperity. We had the climate crusader, Chris Bowen, at the COP meeting the other day, signing up to a declaration to phase out fossil fuels, and this means that 2 of our 3 biggest sources of export income are going to basically be abolished. Look, this is basically an avalanche of economic self-harm, and I think today is just another chapter.
And I think one of the other issues here is it's really about Labor seeking to restructure the economy away from fossil fuels and towards wind and solar. And what this will further allow is the steamrolling of local communities, I suspect, where this so-called national interest test will be used to circumvent the normal consultation process. So if you want to get a coal mine up, well, you're going to be subject to all of these litigation and community interventions. But if you want to get a solar farm or these wind turbines and the high-tension, high-voltage transmission lines, and you object to it as a community, well, the minister will just say it's in the national interest, too bad.
Exactly right. And again, more and more people are going to feel excluded from government. They're going to feel disempowered. They're going to feel that Big Brother or Big Sister is riding roughshod over them. I just don't get this idea that somehow we have to destroy the environment in order to save the planet, and yet there are so many communities in Victoria and New South Wales right now that feel, and Queensland, that feel precisely that. They want to protect their rural lifestyle. They want to protect the aesthetics of their beautiful landscapes, and they are having these forests of wind turbines, these carpets of solar panels forced upon them, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong, and unfortunately, nothing that happened today is going to improve things. In fact, I think what's happening now is going to make it significantly worse.
And when you were in government, you sought to reduce these imposts, including the $1 billion red tape cuts, the abolition of Section 487, which is a lawfare provision, which unfortunately didn't get through the Senate, as well as the one-stop shops, which was the idea that to remove duplication, you only have to go to a state regulator to get approval rather than having to go to the state and the federal as well. And unfortunately, since then, basically, it's all been in the other direction.
Well, exactly right. And it's in this time that Australia has gone from being one of the best places to invest and do resource projects to being a deeply problematic place to invest and do resource projects. And yes, that provision of the EPBC Act, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which allows every green busybody to bring an action in court, as opposed to people who've got a direct interest in the matter at hand. That's what's really unleashed this tidal wave of lawfare, and as I understand it, that's not been touched by any of this legislation.
Now, one of the other major issues on the domestic front has been inflation, up by 3.8% over the past year, which is the highest it has been in about 16 months. So this means that interest rates will almost certainly go up rather than down over the next, say, 6 to 12 month period. I think there are 3 key causes of this. One obviously has been the rising electricity prices, which are up by over a third over the last year. You've got this uncontrolled mass migration, which is putting pressure on the supply that we have. And you've also got government spending, which is growing much faster than the entire economy. So this is really a homegrown, government-caused inflationary problem. This would be a pretty big concern, wouldn't it, for the government?
Well, it's a big concern for the public, because in the end, inflation is a form of theft. It means that we are on an economic treadmill which is going faster and faster, and we're having more and more trouble keeping up financially. That's really what inflation means. Now, it's basically a function of consistently poor economic decision-making by this government, whether it's the destruction of our energy reliability and affordability in the name of combating climate change, which, as you say, has put prices up, electricity prices up 34% over the last 12 months, and it's just going to get worse as government subsidies get withdrawn. Then there's the gargantuan bloating of the public service under this government. It's expanded from 160,000 to 200,000 federal public servants, and I don't think anyone would say that government services have improved in that time. There's the union-friendly changes, which are making it harder and harder to manage business. There's the out-of-control mass immigration. And then, of course, there's all this additional green and red tape, which is symptomatic of a Green left Labor government. So the basic problem is a government that doesn't get it when it comes to the economy. What we need to appreciate is that government can't spend a dollar that it doesn't get from you, the taxpayer. Every time government spends money, it's only doing you a favour if somehow what the government's doing is more efficient than what you could do with the money yourself, and that is rarely the case. So to get the economy ticking over well, we need government spending to be as low as it can be, which enables taxes to be lower. We've got government to use the lightest touch possible when it comes to regulation. I mean, in the end, wealth is not produced by government. Wealth is produced by individuals and businesses, and we need to do everything we can to incentivise individuals and governments to unleash their creative spirits, to have a go at the things that they are good at. And the instinct of this current government is to subsidise people, and the trouble with a subsidy mindset is that it turns business people into rent seekers as opposed to entrepreneurs. So I'm afraid that our economic stagnation is going to deepen under this government. Again, I don't want to sound like some kind of a doom merchant, but nothing that we have seen over the last 3.5 or 4 years from the Albanese government gives us any confidence that it is really economically aware. All of their instincts are to tax, to spend, to regulate, to interfere. We are going down the path of European economic sclerosis, and the sooner we do a U-turn, the better.
One of the things that strikes me about this government is it's very much a redistributionist government, not a growth government. And you can just look at their own budget figures, which show that their ambition is to grow the economy at best by 2.5%. Now, you compare that to the Hawke years where you were getting 4 or 5% real economic growth. In the Howard years, you're getting 3 or 4% real economic growth. There's no emphasis, there's no ambition. And that's the same at the state level. No one's actually talking about growth. And the reality is the only way we're going to get out of these problems, whether it's the debt problem, the deficit problem, is growing our way out of it if we want to maintain the quality of services that we have.
And this is, at least in part, explained, Dan, by the fact that richer people over the last 30 years have tended to vote more left, whereas poorer people over the last 30 years have tended to vote more right. If I'm a retiree with a big share portfolio and a nice fat superannuation balance, sure, I have the luxury of thinking, well, I don't really need that much more. I can pay a bit more for my power. I can pay a green levy on my overseas business class flights and so on. But if I'm a battler out in the suburbs, stuck in traffic jams, having to run 2 cars, struggling to meet school fees, household expenses, you need economic growth. I mean, economic growth is the lifeblood of advancing well-being for the mass of people. Now, I think that at our best, we in the Liberal National Coalition get that, and one of the reasons why I am not pessimistic about the long-term future of the Liberal National Coalition is because in the end, there are always more poor people than rich people, Dan. And that's why I think if we play our cards right, sure, we might find that our political centre of gravity moves from the leafy inner city suburbs to the aspirational suburbs of outer metropolitan areas. But it doesn't matter where you win the seats as long as you win the seats. And that's, I think, what we've got to be determined to do. And we will do that by putting forward to aspirational voters a serious plan to make their life better that involves restraint of government spending, an absolute focus on lowering taxes, reducing regulation, and a recognition that the entrepreneurial spirit is what makes a country great.
Hi, thanks for watching. Did you know that 3/4 of you who are watching this podcast aren't currently subscribed to the IPA's YouTube channel? So do us a favour, hit subscribe so you don't miss any of the action. And while you're at it, head to ipa.org.au and follow the prompts to subscribe to the IPA's website, so that way you'll find all of our research and analysis. Now, back to the chat.
One of the things that might trouble the Liberal National Coalition in the short term are potential or imminent defections. As we talk now, it's about 11:30 a.m. and I think Barnaby Joyce is going to announce defection to One Nation potentially in a couple of hours' time. So, and there may be others who join him. What's your perspective on specifically on the Barnaby Joyce situation, but also more broadly the challenge that One Nation may pose to the dominance of the Liberal Nationals on the centre right?
Well, let's make a couple of points first. First point to make is that I'm a friend of Barnaby's. I respect him and I admire the contribution that he's made thus far to public life. I also have a bit of time for Pauline Hanson. I thought that she was a destructive influence when she first burst upon the scene back in the late 1990s. I think back then the impact of One Nation was to make a lot of decent Australians feel like they were being ripped off, and I could understand why, but I didn't think it was a particularly helpful thing to do. Since then, as a minor party in the Senate, she's certainly been the least obstructive and the most constructive when it comes to good policy. So I make those two general, I suppose I make those specific points about the two key individuals. Now let me get down to the fundamentals. I think it's a little bit beneath Barnaby what he is about to do. I think he should be bigger than this. The National Party put him into Parliament. The National Party made him the Deputy Prime Minister. Everything that he has been able to achieve in public life has been through and with the National Party. And I think it's a little selfish to suddenly say, well, the National Party is not giving me the recognition that I think I deserve, therefore I'm going to have a dummy spit and go off to One Nation, which might make me the next leader. So I just think it's a pity. The other point I make is that in the end, One Nation is a party of protest, perhaps the most constructive of the various parties of protest, but it is in the end a party of protest. And what we need in this country is better parties of government. And as my old mentor, B.A. Santa Maria, used to say to his devoted followers, decide which of the two mainstream political parties best reflects your position, join that and try to make it better, as good as it can be. It'll never be perfect, but try to make it as good as it can be. I guess a particular point I should make is that Barnaby began this kind of long, I suppose, divorce proceeding, claiming that he was upset about the fact that we still had net zero in our policy platform, and the National Party first and now the Liberal Party have abandoned quite properly the net zero straitjacket. But Barnaby, instead of saying, well, thank you, you've seen my point, we can now reconcile, instead of saying, let's reconcile, he's saying, nah, sorry, there are a whole lot of other things that were really driving me out, so I'm off. Now, I just think that's a little bit beneath him. He's a good man, Barnaby. I just don't think he's quite being his best self at the moment.
And it was also the Nationals under Barnaby's leadership, along with Scott Morrison, who signed us up to net zero.
And we all know that Barnaby was deeply reluctant to do so. We all know that this was put to a vote inside the National Party, and there's some argument as to whether it was a 1-vote margin or a 3-vote margin. It was very close inside the National Party room. Barnaby was never very happy with it. But my fundamental point is he wanted us to dump the net zero straitjacket. That's now been done. So why leave? Why leave?
Just on One Nation, so they're at around 15% in the polls on a primary basis. There are some who are suggesting that One Nation could become kind of like the Australian version of Reform, where Nigel Farage has usurped the major parties. As yet, obviously, they don't have any lower house members in federal parliament. Do you think it's possible that, based on the current circumstances, One Nation could become the dominant centre-right party, or do you think that it will always be predominantly a protest party?
Well, it's one thing to be discontented and unhappy. It's another thing to have a constructive way forward. And I think that the grievances that are articulated by Pauline Hanson are often not unreasonable. The difficulty with all of these minor parties is that they are much better at complaining than improving. They are much better at, as it were, tearing down than building up. And what we need in this country, and indeed across the West right now, are constructive changes that will make a bad situation worse. I mean, I often used to say back in the Howard days, it's easy to spend money, it's hard to make a difference. It's easy to point to problems, it's hard to articulate solutions. It's easy to put out a press release, it's easy to make a speech, but to actually implement change for the better is hard. So look, I think it's unlikely that One Nation in Australia would loom as large as a challenge to the established political parties as Reform does in Britain, for two reasons. A, I think that we are not as far gone as Britain down the economic stagnation and societal fragmentation path.
So you reckon it's worse in the UK?
I think it's worse in the UK. And I also think that Nigel Farage is a very substantial figure. I personally would not be voting for Reform were I in Britain, whatever sympathy I might have with the critique. But I do think Nigel is a very substantial figure. I mean, but for Nigel, the whole Brexit campaign would never have succeeded. Yes, Boris Johnson, in the end, brought it to fruition, but it was sustained pressure from Nigel over at least 2 decades that created the circumstances for Brexit to happen. And I know there's still plenty of remoaning from the British establishment, but despite all the current difficulties that Britain is enduring, its future will be best safeguarded as an independent sovereign country, not as an outlying province of some kind of European superstate. So look, these are difficult times, Dan, for all the mainstream parties. Yes, they're masked in this country because Labor can rely much more on Green preferences than we can rely on One Nation and other minor party preferences. But the left establishment and the right establishment are felt by adherents on both sides to have let people down. And what we really need in all of the Anglosphere countries is a resurgence of strong and principled leadership, which is capable of persuading people and inspiring people that there are ways to improve our countries, which can be put in place and can succeed.
I'm interested as to your assessment that the UK is a bit more far gone than Australia. Is that because of its sort of migration challenges and the issues with London and the economy being sclerotic? I'm just interested in how you form that assessment, and whether you think Australia is on that path or whether we're on a different path entirely.
I think there's no doubt we're on the same path. We are on the same path of economic stagnation and societal fragmentation and strategic peril. We are on the same path, no doubt about it. I don't think we're quite as far advanced, in part because I think that we are more used to mass immigration, and it tends not to be as difficult for us because we have always been an immigrant society, whereas Britain was not really an immigrant society until quite recently. So I think that's one thing. I just think that, and this is very superficial at one level, but because our weather is so much better, I think our mood tends to be better. It's hard to be despondent about the world if the sun is shining, the waves are rolling in on Manly Beach. If you're out in the bush, which is, the bush hath friends to greet him, and their kindly voices meet him, and the murmur of the breezes and the river and the rivers on their bars. I mean, I just think that there's a sunny optimism about Australians, which is less prevalent in Britain, which helps us. But economic stagnation, societal fragmentation, government which is getting bigger and bigger, the increasing bureaucratisation of decision making, waves of migrants who are not really assimilating but are forming enclaves and are sometimes deeply unsympathetic to the liberal pluralism which is a characteristic of Anglosphere societies. That's worse in Britain than it is here.
I just want to turn to the international front. Recently, you've written an article for The Australian where you were fairly critical of the, I guess, if you want to call it a peace deal that's being brokered between Ukraine and Russia, and in particular in relation to President Trump's...
It hasn't been brokered, Dan. I mean, this is basically President Trump attempting to force the Ukrainians to into a ceasefire, which I fear will not be a peace, it will just be a pause. Look, what I think President Trump and his various emissaries have failed to grasp is that the Russian president is dead set on recreating the Russia of Peter the Great. I mean, Vladimir Putin has said time and time again that the collapse of the old Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He is at heart an incorrigible Russian imperialist. Ever since he's been in power in Russia, there have been grievous troubles on Russia's borders. Every one of Russia's neighbours has either been invaded or destabilised or turned into a virtual Russian satellite. And he is, I think, absolutely intransigent in his objectives. And yes, he might be prepared to make a few little minor compromises and minor adjustments as temporary concessions until he resumes his implacable push to bring Ukraine, which he calls Kievan Rus, little Russia, until he brings it under Russian control. And what President Trump and his emissaries don't seem to grasp is that the only way to effectively guarantee rump Ukraine's sovereignty and practical independence is to have at least a significant tripwire force of allied troops present in Ukraine, so that the next time the Russian tyrant is tempted to attack, he won't just be fighting the Ukrainians, but he will be fighting a strong democratic partnership. Now, doesn't necessarily mean that this tripwire force has got to be NATO badged, but it's got to comprise troops from serious countries, and the obvious candidates would be Britain and France. The British Prime Minister, in one of his better moments, has offered to lead a coalition of the willing to establish a stabilisation force. I hope he presses ahead with that, regardless of any of these discussions that are going on between the Russians and the Americans, to which the Ukrainians are, if you like, helpless passengers. And frankly, if there is going to be a British stabilisation force in Ukraine, I hope Australia will participate, perhaps under the whole AUKUS umbrella. As things stand, this whole thing has a strong whiff of Munich about it, which we will remember was when the French and then Britain forced the Czechoslovakians to surrender their fortified border areas to the Germans. Hitler at the time said that I have no more territorial ambitions in Europe, and notoriously 6 months later he grabbed the rest of what was then Czechoslovakia, and 12 months later we were at war. Now, I'm not saying that there are exact parallels, but I think what we can learn from the 1930s, and we must not repeat now in the 2020s, is this idea that somehow you can appease dictators. You can't. The only thing that dictators understand and respond to is strength, not weakness.
What about the argument that's made by some, particularly within sort of, I guess, the MAGA movement, that they've had enough of America having to underwrite international security for other nations who, in some cases, may have been recalcitrant, particularly in Europe, of doing it for themselves, and that they don't want to be sending their treasure and their blood to fight these wars anymore? Is there validity to that perspective?
Well, I can understand the feeling, because there is no doubt that America has been the guardian of the free world these last 7 decades or so, and America has spent massively, and there's been a lot of bloodshed by Americans on behalf of others, and it's vastly to America's credit that it's done all of this. I think the MAGA crowd are underestimating just how bad for America a world that is no longer under the Anglo-American ascendancy would turn out to be. And I also think that if they do believe that America should, as it were, leave at least parts of the world more to their own devices, and yes, Europe certainly should have been doing more for its own security these last 30 years or so since the fall of the Berlin Wall. What I think they should say is, look, we're under no illusions about Russia. We're under no illusions about the Russian dictator. But within 3 years, let's say, we expect you guys to be wholly responsible for the security of Europe. Let's organise a phased transition. At the moment, what looks like happening is that the Americans will simply suspend intelligence cooperation, satellite surveillance, etc., which they've been supplying to the Ukrainians. And the problem is that in the short term, the British and the French don't have the ability to entirely fill that gap.
Okay, fair enough. Look, Tony, we'll leave it there for today. So thank you as always for your insights and observations, and we'll catch up in about a fortnight.
I look forward to that, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.